group. It meets every Saturday at 3 p.m. in Dodge Hall Cafe, where we read the history of the left. So we start all the way back with the radical bourgeois philosophers, Kant, Rousseau, Hegel, Smith. Then we read Marx, and then we read the Second International Marxists, Lenin, Luxemburg, Trotsky, and then we read the Frankfurt School. And the point is really to learn about what the left once was, how it died, and think about what that might mean for us today. We also host discussions on the left, such as this one, about important issues in the history of the left and pressing issues in the present. And we try to invite a diverse perspective, diversity of perspectives on the left to discuss questions that we think aren't being discussed but ought to be discussed, such as the legacy of one Bayard Rustin. We will be having another panel today at 2 p.m. on the American Revolution. It's called What is the American Revolution for the Left? And part of the purpose of that panel is really to reopen the question of the left's relationship to America and the American Revolution, especially in light of all the criticisms of the 1619 Project that have come out of the left, but also the support for the 1619 Project that has come out of parts of the left. And so that's kind of what we try and do on campus. And then we also have a journal we publish called the Platypus Review, which can be found online or kind of around in the little newspaper stands. We put them there. So today, Coleman Hughes, student at Columbia, and Jim Cregan, a longtime leftist at large, have agreed to talk to us about the legacy of Bayard Rustin, who was on the left, who is taken up today by people on the left, but as we'll hear kind of from our panelists, especially from Coleman, he's taken up today perhaps in a way that has very little to do with who he was and what he thought. And so that's kind of why we want to have this discussion. And so kind of just for the format, so people know, Coleman and Jim are both going to give a short presentation. Then I'm going to ask each of them kind of a question, and then we're going to open it up for general discussion. So let's thank our panelists.
I go first?
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction. It's not every day that I'm invited to speak at an event hosted by Marxists. In fact, my politics have more than once been described as conservative, and I've sometimes thought of myself as a libertarian. But upon reflection, I find that my appearing here is not so strange after all. For one thing, my mother was basically a Marxist, and as a result, I could say the names Karl Marx, Emile Durkheim, and Antonio Gramsci before I could spell my own. For another thing, many of my favorite thinkers, Thomas Sowell, Eldridge Cleaver, Eugene Genovese, to name a few, began their careers as dyed-in-the-wool Marxists. I think this is no accident. Whether it's a realistic doctrine or not, Marxism is certainly a universalist doctrine, by which I mean it is thought to apply to all people, regardless of race, religion, sexual orientation, and so forth. In an era when progressive politics has been subdivided into race interests, gender interests, sexual orientation interests, and so forth, it's no accident that those who reject the attempt to divide the human race into such trivial categories would form alliances, even if only temporarily. Which brings me to the subject of my talk today, Bayard Rustin. Rustin was an activist on the front lines of the civil rights movement, strategist for Martin Luther King Jr., and an essayist of the highest caliber. His politics, however, were difficult to characterize. On the one hand, he was a member of the Young Communist League in the 1930s and was fond of throwing the word lumpen proletariat into his polemics. On the other hand, he quickly left the communists. He never described himself as a Marxist in his essays or letters explicitly, and he opposed communism throughout the Cold War. Today, we might call Rustin a democratic socialist, but even that term isn't quite right. It's not clear that he would be welcomed by the likes of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders. This is because he believed fundamentally in the unity of the human family. That may sound like a platitude, but carried to its logical conclusion, it is one of the most profound ideas ever devised at the intersection of ethics and politics. And Rustin did carry it to its logical conclusion. In 1982, students at Harvard Law School boycotted a class on legal issues surrounding race because the class was to be taught by a white professor. Rustin came to that professor's defense, writing, quote, "The objection that Mr. Greenberg is white is nothing more than blatant racism. That is, the denial of a person's right to pursue certain activities solely on account of his race. Blacks, as victims of racial discrimination, should be the first to reject the view that race can disqualify one from a particular pursuit," unquote. In other words, the same principle that had led Rustin to organize the March on Washington 2 decades earlier, the same principle he had fought for and gotten arrested for about 24 times during the Civil Rights Movement, led him to come to the defense of a white professor being attacked by college students. So he was remarkably consistent. When a feminist writer criticized Rustin's brand of socialism for being too male, Rustin offered a defense that illustrated his opposition to identity politics in general. Here I quote in full. "In the past few years, I have seen all too many blacks fall into the trap of calling any white person who disagrees with them a racist. I have always considered this practice unethical as well as a sign of deep insecurity. A person who is intellectually competent and confident in his or her position can defend that position without having to stoop to name calling. It follows from this introduction of ad hoc attacks into political discourse that a white person cannot talk about problems affecting blacks and vice versa, Pittsburghers cannot talk about problems affecting New Yorkers and vice versa, and on ad infinitum. People who engage in such attacks may want a just society, but will build no more than a Tower of Babel." End quote. I think that alone would probably disqualify him from the Democratic Socialists today. Rustin's rejection of identity politics may seem strange given his earlier role in the Civil Rights Movement, but his views never changed. The circumstances changed. When blacks could not vote, they had every reason to protest. But the moment they could vote, protest ceased to be the wise strategy. After the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the problem shifted from being primarily political in nature to primarily economic in nature. Black people could now get into restaurants and movies and so forth, but what good was that if they had no money? As Rustin saw it, economic solutions required progressive legislation such as full employment and public housing. And that meant voting in progressive congressmen rather than protesting in the streets. And that's the argument of his essay, From Protest to Politics, which I'm told is on your club syllabus. Just as Rustin's politics emphasized class over race, it emphasized tangible results over spiritual transformations. On this basis, he, along with Dr. King, rejected the turn of anti-racist activism that began in 1966 with the call for Black Power. Black Power was not a political program like the Civil Rights Movement. It was instead a pose, a lifestyle, a mode of self-expression, rather like painting your nails black and becoming emo. As Rustin put it, quote, "One is supposed to think black, dress black, eat black, and buy black without reference to the question of what such a program actually contributes to advancing the cause of social justice." End quote. On our campus, intersectionality plays the same role. Rustin rejected the spiritualization of politics. He closes out his essay, The Failure of Black Separatism, by writing, quote, "The strategy I have outlined must stand or fall by its capacity to achieve political and economic results. It is not intended to provide some new wave of intellectual excitement. It is not intended to suggest a new style of life or a means to personal salvation for disaffected members of the middle class. Nor is either of these the proper role of politics. My strategy is simply a vehicle by which the wealth of this nation can be redistributed and some of its more grievous social problems solved." End quote. Of course, there's nothing wrong with self-expression. In most contexts, it's a beautiful thing, but politics is not the proper medium for it. In a democracy, politics is by definition a realm of compromise and debate. and your identity is precisely that which you cannot compromise on. What's more, we've come to the point where one's politics are thought to be logically entailed by one's identity and vice versa. So more than once, a person, after hearing me speak, has asked me if I identify as Black. The thinking being that my opinions don't sound very Black, whatever Black opinions sound like. Therefore, it's open to doubt whether I am Black. Recently, the writer Masha Gessen called Pete Buttigieg, quote, a straight politician in a gay man's body, as if he is attracted to men, but his politics are attracted to women. Rustin, of course, was both Black and gay, and in death, it seems like that's all the world wants to remember him for. Search Rustin's name on YouTube, and you will find flashy videos made by and for millennials, which highlight the fact that he was gay. On the one hand, it's a sign of moral progress that we live in a society that can make those videos at all. But on the other hand, it's a sign that we are utterly missing the point of his work. If Rustin were alive to see his legacy hijacked by those who do not understand it, he might say what he said in 1986, replying to a request to be part of a gay Black anthology. Quote, "My activism did not spring from my being gay, or for that matter, from my being Black. Rather, it is rooted fundamentally in my Quaker upbringing and the values that were instilled in me by my grandparents who reared me. Those values are based on the concept of a single human family and the belief that all members of that family are equal. Adhering to those values has meant making a stand against injustice to the best of my ability, whenever and wherever it occurs." End quote.
Okay. Yes. I have a somewhat less laudatory view of Bayard Rustin, which goes back in my tortuous political career to the 1960s, when I was a member of SDS and an activist against the war in Vietnam. I watched Coleman Hughes' video on the New York Times webpage. And on it, and here he says we shouldn't cherry pick our heroes, and I agree. He also says that the hero he has chosen, Bayard Rustin, shouldn't be appreciated because he was Black or gay, but because of his political actions and ideas. I agree with this also. What I have trouble with, however, is Rustin's ideas and actions themselves. I wrote a long article on this for Portside a few years ago, attempting to show that those ideas and actions, especially in his later career, basically do not entitle Rustin, at least for anyone with anything near my politics, to the status that Coleman wishes to confer upon him. The devotees of Rustin's memory tend to emphasize the earlier part of his life, in which he did indeed do many heroic things. He was jailed for several years as a conscientious objector during World War II. He sat in North Carolina on a segregated bus 8 years before Rosa Parks did the same in Montgomery. And above all, he was the principal organizer of the March on Washington, and not Martin Luther King, whom Rustin said could not bring vampires to a bloodbath. I believe that was his phrase. But he was the organizer. But in the following years, his life began to take another turn. 1964 was the year of the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City. And the Mississippi delegation, the Jim Crow segregated all-white delegation, was challenged there by a group from Mississippi called the Freedom Democratic Party. And Lyndon Johnson was frantic. There was testimony by Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a sharecropper from Mississippi, about the reign of terror in her state. It was an election year. Lyndon Johnson was frantic to get Fannie Lou Hamer off the air. So finally Johnson proposed a compromise, and that was that two Freedom SDP delegates be seated at the convention, token delegates without votes, alongside the segregated white Mississippi delegation. The majority of the Freedom Democratic Party at the Democratic Convention rejected this compromise, all except one person, and that was Bayard Rustin, whom one member of the MSDP, of whom one member said, "You are a traitor, Bayard." And from this point, Rustin's career took a very different turn. He was under the wing of the Johnson-Humphrey wing of the Democratic Party, and to whom he remained loyal throughout all of his life. Now, Coleman says that he admired Rustin because he opposed black separatism and emphasized the importance of economics and the class struggle and class in the struggle of black people and in general. And these things may be positive in and of themselves. I think they are. But we have to consider the context. But the Cold War offered a bargain to certain people, liberals, and certain people on the American left. That is, support for certain reforms like the Civil Rights Act, the war on poverty under the Johnson administration. But that didn't come for free. It came in exchange for certain other things like unstinting loyalty in the global defense of the regime of private property that the US government was waging throughout the world during the Cold War. This is the devil's bargain that Rustin embraced with both arms. He refused, in distinction to Martin Luther King, to condemn the Vietnam War, and he red-baited those who did. First, by writing a letter to the New York Post, signed by several others, denouncing the first big anti-war demonstration in Washington against the war, which I attended at the time, but because it allowed people who called for the unconditional withdrawal of US troops and some who called for the victory of the Vietnam. And he joined other Cold War socialists in signing a petition supporting rigged elections in the Dominican Republic after 42,000 US troops had ousted the reformist President Juan Bosch. He was a member of, Rustin was a member of an outfit called Social Democrats USA, founded by a man who was very important in his life in politics called Max Shachtman. Originally a follower of Leon Trotsky, Shachtman split with Trotsky in 1940 and from then on moved steadily to the right, ending up on the side of US imperialism, not to put too fine a point upon it. Shachtman first looked to the left wing of the AFL-CIO officialdom as a vehicle of progress, but when they split over the Vietnam War in the late 60s, Rustin went with it, along with Shachtman, with the pro-Cold War, pro-Vietnam George Meany wing of the AFL-CIO. From that point, he's embarked on his trajectory, which was to end in his being, I would say, without qualification, a neoconservative at the end of his life. He wrote mostly in commentary magazines. Some of you know what that is. He was a fervent supporter of Israel. He supported the South African-backed intervention against the guerrillas fighting Portuguese colonialism in Angola and Mozambique, and urged the Carter administration to send greater aid to these Portuguese and South African forces, arguing that racial and colonial oppression was secondary to the need to fight communism. He was a founder of the Committee on the Present Danger. The former principled pacifist urged the expansion of the nuclear arms race. Was all this simply a matter of the evolution of his thinking? Was it simply because he came to regard communism is the lesser evil to U.S. imperialism. I think there is a very strong reason to think more is involved in this. As he was, for about 20 years, Rustin was the head of the A. Philip Randolph Institute, which was a division of the AFL-CIO. So that his paychecks came from George Meany and the AFL-CIO. And those, including his sympathetic biographer, John D'Amelio, have said that at that point, Rustin realized that if he opposed the Vietnam War or defied Meany in any way, that he would, and that this position would no longer be his. There was a political framework defined by the most right-wing elements of the Democratic Party that Rustin felt that he had to stay within, and he did, consistently. So, for all these reasons, and despite Rustin's early life, which I think he should be given credit for, I would submit that Rustin ended his life as something less than a champion of social progress, and is not entitled, therefore, to be lionized as a hero of the Black freedom struggle or any other struggle for progress.
Okay, so thanks both of you. So before we open it up for questions, I want to give you guys a chance to maybe respond to each other, and I also have maybe questions that could guide that for each of you. And so, Coleman, my question for you is, how is it, what happens such that kind of the politics of civil rights goes from the civil rights movement, integrationism, the March for Washington for Jobs and Freedom, to the Black nationalism of the 70s? What kind of, and then even further to what we have today, identity politics. What do you think kind of causes that change? And then, Jim, I wanted to ask you about kind of how Bayard Rustin's trajectory is influenced by the early Shachtman split in Trotskyism. How is it that you go from Shachtman and Bayard Rustin and the work that they were doing in the Socialist Party? How does that kind of end up in the realignment strategy within the Democrats? And then, as you kind of noted, Bayard Rustin ending his life really in the Democratic Party. But also feel free if you want to touch on each other's remarks.
So as far as your question, I think it's a complicated progression. You know, you have the nation in 1963 uniting around the ethic of judging people just by the content of their characters, not the color of their skin. And then by 1966, you have Black Power, and that basically captures the moral imagination of certainly the youngest generation of Black Americans. And I would argue the Black Lives Matter movement is really a late stage Black Power movement, because the fundamental principle, which is to center your Black identity as a kind of politics, is just an extension of the Black Power movement. How you got from one to the other is certainly a complex story. There's no one cause. Part of it might just be there is always a pull towards human tribalism in general. The forces of universalism are sort of always at a disadvantage because humans are tribal creatures by nature. So the person coming in with a message that draws the boundary of what our group is smaller always has something of an inbuilt advantage. So really the thing to explain is not really why the Black Power movement gained steam, but why there were a few years when the predominant moral message was universalist. That's really the anomaly historically to explain. Groups, racial or ethnic groups demanding political dispensations for their group is the most normal thing throughout history. So I would reverse the question.
I just think briefly that what I mentioned, the failure of the delegation of the Freedom Democratic Party, tended to disillusion a lot of black leaders with the whole cause of democratically black liberalism and integrationist liberalism, and then there was, of course, the influence of Malcolm X. But that wasn't your question. Your question was about Shachtman. Max Shachtman was a man of outstanding literary and oratorical talents, and he first came to prominence in the US left as a follower of Leon Trotsky. But in 1940, there was a split in the Socialist Workers' Party, which was the American Trotskyist group, in which Shachtman and Trotsky wound up on opposite sides. Because Shachtman rejected, in the wake of the Hitler-Stalin pact, Shachtman rejected the party's position on unconditional defense of the USSR. Shachtman didn't move sharply to the right immediately after that split, but gradually he did. And I think that in his split from the Socialist Workers' Party, we can see a logic which ultimately led him to the position that he wound up with. Because if you believe that the Soviet Union represented a historical form of a class society that was in competition with capitalism, and that was authoritarian and under which workers had no liberty, but then it was easy to take the next step and to regard capitalism, in which there were unions, and in some countries a parliamentary democracy, as the lesser evil to Stalinist totalitarianism, to the Soviet system. In my view, that completely, Stalinism was totalitarian and workers didn't have any rights, but there's a complete overestimation of that, what Trotskyists call Stalinophobia, of the historical significance of Stalinism. But that logic ultimately led Max Shachtman to embrace the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Vietnam War, and to be harder than the most democratic hardliners on the foreign policy. He became a Scoop Jackson Democrat. Scoop Jackson was in favor of the welfare of state at home and arms build-up of militarism abroad.
Open it up to questions.
I just say one thing. So, I think I agree with much of what you said about Rustin, especially on the Vietnam War, on the Cold War. The way I view that is, it's not that I have a different assessment of the facts than you, I think, but I do have more appreciation for what Rustin stood for domestically, and a little bit of a wall of separation or between that and foreign policy. So, for example, I'm a big fan of W.B. Du Bois. The fact that he loved Stalin doesn't prevent me from loving his commentary on race in America. Whether one separates that and lionizes someone is, to some extent, a question of personality difference. But in the same way that we lionize Du Bois despite loving Stalin, I would say it's possible to sort of segment the parts of Rustin that were truly perceptive and unusually so from the parts that were not.
Okay, lots of questions. Kim had his hand up first, I think. So
Just to follow up on the last point you made and touch on a couple of points you made. What if is it possible to appreciate W.E.B. Du Bois not in spite of his loving of Stalin, but because of it? And what would that, maybe that's actually a redeeming aspect of Du Bois? Or what do you think Du Bois thought? Right? When you talk about sort of the early 60s moment when Rustin is debating Malcolm X in Harlem about segregation, as an anomaly relative to, right? Because you brought up this question of like, if you think about the different opportunities open to Black struggle, the Black freedom movement in the early 60s, and the way in which it went, which was, toward Black power, which is like a way, like sort of not in the direction that Rustin was sort of advocating for in the early 60s. You said that like actually the early 60s movement is sort of more of an anomaly. It's not the failure of that should be explained, but actually like how it came about at all, right? And that's interesting, but like that's where I find Cregan trying to root Rustin in the history of the left through Shachtman interesting. So then the question is like, was that like what do you make of Rustin's debate with Malcolm X in the early 60s? And that's a question for Cregan, but it's kind of also a question for kind of a commentary for both of you, because like I see that as like an opportunity for the left. I see that as an opportunity for the left that was sort of missed. And yeah, and then yeah.
Shall I answer? Yeah. Okay. Of course, how you are going to evaluate Rustin depends on the relative issues or the relative importance that you assign to the issues involved in his politics. To me, the anti-colonial struggle and the class struggle that was going on in the world at that time had as its main focus, or had as its main enemy, I should say, the Western powers and the United States. I think that was the decisive struggle, and therefore that is the principal basis on which I judge Rustin. Now, about his debate with Malcolm X and his opposition to Black separatism and Black nationalism, as I said, in itself, I think that is a good thing. But he did so from the point of view of liberal integration, which had as its major premise loyalty to the existing social order and one of its major parties, especially at the time that was involved in the Vietnam butchery. So there was another, and he hoped that by remaining loyal, he could pass certain reform legislation. And there was certain reform legislation passed, but also the social programs, the war on poverty. Very few people talked about that in the Johnson administration after the Vietnam War began to escalate. But that didn't prevent Rustin from defecting. Someone else did defect. His name was Martin Luther King. He opposed the war in Vietnam, not from a Black nationalist or separatist perspective, but from a left liberal integrationist perspective, which was willing to denounce Johnson and the war. Right before he was assassinated, he was building up this Poor People's March on Washington, which I also attended, at least a day of. And that was an attempt to organize, basically an attempt to say that the issue, it was not simply Black civil rights, it was a broader issue, it was a class issue. But he did so from outside the ambit of the Democratic Party and support for U.S. imperialism. Rustin didn't.
So there's a claim at work that Rustin's early radicality was there, but then at the end of his life, his horizon was a mere liberal integrationist perspective, or that he capitulated to the Democratic Party politics. And I wonder if his own self-understanding was not so much that he had capitulated, but maybe the world had failed him in a sense. That his early radicality was premised on the fact that there would be this socialist movement that was growing. It was going to take responsibility for total human emancipation, including but not limited to the Black question. And I wonder in what sense, after that failed to materialize, is that going to be justified in his later life practices?
That's an interesting hypothesis. I mean, I think if you want to understand what's happening, it might be useful to separate his opinion on race and economic policy in the United States from his opinion on the spread of global communism and its containment. If you look at what Bayard Rustin thought in 1940 about race and about, what economic policies we need to see in America, I'm not sure that was different at all from what he thought in 1980, not in principle at least. However, I think most, if not all, the things you pointed to about his departure from being radical, your term, comes in the realm of foreign policy. So was there a change domestically? I don't think so.
Well, I just pointed to it,
Which is,
which is that King became convinced of the need to, and King remained an integration. He was never a black separatist. But he broke with the Democratic Party of the Vietnam War, but also saw the necessity of organizing a class movement of poor people from the ground up. And that was the meaning of this Poor People's March that he planned on Washington, that was headed by some of his closest aides, like James Patton. You wouldn't find Rustin there, but because Rustin knew that would not meet with the approval of the powers that be. And so, I think it did have an effect on his. On his orientation toward domestic politics and black politics. Yes, that certain black organizations like SNCC were moving away from liberalism in the direction of black nationalism. But there was a movement away from establishment liberalism that was not black nationalist. And Rustin declined to support it.
Spencer.
Yeah, I wonder if we could open up this question of the Cold War a little bit more, and imperialism. And I guess I'm wondering if, I guess I'm not satisfied with any of the sort of theories of it that are being used thus far to this point, that it was just a global project of protecting private property. I think it was that in part, but I don't find that to be an adequate political understanding. And the obvious fact is that it was never portrayed that way as a political project. And was there nothing convincing about the political dimension of the Cold War? And I don't believe that it's foreign policy either. I don't think that that's adequate. That we can make a clean distinction between what's domestic and what's foreign, and not only because of the issue of resources going to guns or butter. But I think that the issue of imperialism is a domestic issue in a whole lot of ways, including how we relate to the state, and the power of the state, and the claims of the state on our lives, and of course ultimately their ability to dispose of the lives of citizens. And so I guess I would ask Jim, as carrying so much experience, how has your view of imperialism changed, especially in light of what I think I don't know if you shared these, but I think in the 1960s there were some extremely improbable notions that one or another outcome in Vietnam made a difference in the world revolution. And I'm not sure that it did. It made a big difference to the people of Vietnam. But whether it would really make a difference to the people of Europe, the United States, and Japan, I'm really not as convinced as students in the 1960s may have been about that. In other words, that victory for the Viet Cong was part of a strategy for world socialism. I'm not as convinced of that. And I'm wondering if your thinking over the past 50 years has changed on that. And to Coleman, I guess I would ask, why do you think that the AFL-CIO and George Meany and the people to which Bayard Rustin answered couldn't give way on imperialism? Why, in the face of such massive social discontent with overseas imperial adventures like the Vietnam War, would the leading organization of the organized working class in the United States not really be able to respond to that political pressure? And how do you understand that the way in which that march worked?
You want to go first, but I think about how to answer these questions.
I want to think about how to answer this question. Can you pose it again?
What is the issue of imperialism really? Right? Is it okay? It's a litmus test, right? That Jim has invoked. That, look, this is a crime, right? He's supporting imperialism. But I don't think that the issue. I guess I'm saying, what is that issue? Why did that become a major fault line in the 1960s? And how, for Jim, might you look at that differently? Right? Is it just a matter of wasting money that could be used on social programs? Is it just a matter of supporting the rich in Vietnam? Or is it just a matter of the defense of global property, private property rights? What kind of political issue is imperialism looking back now from 2020? I mean, nobody today believes that anything happening in Vietnam or in South America or in Africa matters at all whatsoever. They don't talk about foreign policy ever anywhere in global politics, right? If there's a war in Africa, the left doesn't know anything about it. Actually, takes very little cognizance of it. Right? We have a completely different view of these things now, and so how does that change the way that we look at the way that the imperialism question was posed, and of course ultimately Bayard Rustin's position on it, and the AFL-CIO's position, Chapman's position in the 60s?
Well, first, you want to go or you want me to? Okay. I think that first of all, the Cold you speak of the political question. And of course, the Cold War was waged as a global defense of freedom and democracy. I think that no one with the knowledge of what was actually going on could swallow that line. Because I think at its heart, it was what I said. It was a defense of the global regime of private property because the US had no control about supporting brutal right-wing dictatorship throughout the world. Now, has my thinking changed about imperialism and Vietnam? Well, I mean, first of all, I didn't exactly share all of the illusions of the New Left, even at the time. I think that Vietnam had a radicalizing influence throughout the world, and the movements that took place at that time. I think it had it was a fillip to various other national liberation movements, but was like the Vietnamese national liberation. But was it decisive? I mean, the New Left, and this is quite common for every political movement on the left that succeeds. I mean, the New Left went too far in thinking, in first of all, trying to adopt guerrilla strategy, in thinking that imperialism would be brought down through the spread of 2-3 many Vietnams as Che Guevara said, and that this was this was the fulcrum of the world struggle against imperialism. I think that was wrong. Imperialism. Now, I mean, part of it was the timing. With the defeat of the U.S. in Vietnam took place after the radical student and youth movements and minority movements in the West had subsided. This was in 1975, I believe, so it was kind of an anti. But even then, this infatuation with guerrilla strategy, I always thought it was inappropriate for Western capitalist countries. And as in the case with most revolutionary movements that thought that they were on the verge of the apocalypse, capitalism and imperialism, which I still think is an adequate descriptor, have proved much more resilient and much more powerful than we thought it was then, or that they thought it was in 1918.
Thoughts on imperialism, or we can take another question.
Can I actually follow up on Spencer's question? Because actually to concentrate, I guess this is the best to pose a question about Rustin's legacy. I mean, whether imperialism or, I mean, Vietnam obviously, I mean, I certainly argue that Vietnam changed America more than World War II did in the end. But when I wrote my book and was writing around 2012 on anticipation of all that would come since, I certainly speak. I am not sparing to Bayard Rustin about many of his associations. There's somewhat more nuance than James would allow, and certainly I would argue for the validity as far as when the war first began about the validity of distinction between opposing the war and actually being pro-Viet Cong. But what I say, not anticipating events of the last several years, what I wrote about Rustin is that for all of that, and for all that was shocking then about how Bayard Rustin's reputation has been refashioned for purposes of the gay rights movement, and what it said about where liberalism was going, that how much could be forgotten. I immediately followed that up with it would still be a mistake to classify Rustin as a neoconservative. Indeed, what he was in a lot of ways earliest prophet of post-Cold War liberalism, a very elitist, even bureaucratic approach to civil rights questions and even to identity politics questions. The way he not to take anything away from what was very genuine and admirable about his involvement in the gay rights movement, but the whole paradigm. Certainly, I would. Anyone who hasn't watched Coleman's New York Times video essay, please do. That certainly communicates very powerfully as far as present day revolution needs its own whole story. And you also, I do certainly feel, I do certainly feel Coleman is correct about what was unchanged in Rustin's views on race from 1940 1980, and probably a lot of his attitudes about politics and somewhat elitist theory of political change probably does also owe something to his Quaker upbringing. I guess I'm just offering that as a way of approaching Spencer's question, Rustin's case, and how he looked at domestic politics. And
I know there. I'm sorry. I did have a question, something in the form of a question at the end of that, but oh, you want to?
No, I'm inviting our friend.
But does that help put along the way of voting Spencer's question? I mean, yes, he's certainly right about imperialism not being the way. I mean, the Black Lives Matter or intellectuals have basically no interest in Africa, as far as how much.
Well, they have an official stance on Israel Palestine.
What?
They have a stance on Israel Palestine.
Yeah,
Whatever that's worth.
whatever that's.
What is it? So does a newborn baby.
No, I mean, I think putting the issue of Israel-Palestine on its merits to the side, just the reason Black Lives Matter has a position on it, is only because of domestic politics. For them, it's a symbolic issue that is not to be analyzed on its own terms, but an opportunity to graft the semblance of American racial politics onto the entire world lazily.
Oh, but that was also very. I guess to bring it back to talking about things, that was also very true of the neocons. A lot of them, there were a core of ideologues, which it really was about an idea of global democratic revolution that could be traced back to Chapman and even Trotsky. And I mean, those people did exist, but Rustin, I certainly feel, is in the category of people for whom it was about domestic politics. They had, I was one about it. They did have personal loyalty to a lot to a number of politicians, by Hubert Humphrey in particular, who did have a lot to do, who were very important to making the success of the civil rights movement, and felt very personally hurt and betrayed by where the politics of Vietnam ended up going, or by the New Left, and that led many, Rustin very much included, to some terrible decisions. I guess I'm just offering this as one way to look at Spencer's question as it relates to Rustin and domestic politics and what is imperialism or politics. I guess what I would say, or what I said in that same passage of my book, is that what I define as Rustin's earliest prophet of post-Cold War liberalism, writing again in 2012 when we hardly knew what post-Cold War liberalism had become or was becoming, that moralist and interventionist, if decidedly not militarist, in foreign affairs is how I put it in that passage. I think. Anyway, no, please, if there's anything you want to expand on.
We're getting to the end. I want to take the last two questions and then we'll wrap up. So Kevin and then Marta.
Yeah, so this is following up on Aaron's original question and also Dave's question. So who's to the left or more left wing, Bayard Rustin or the sort of black power, black nationalist term? Because, Rustin, himself critiques the black power term as being conservative, but most of the left at the time saw Rustin in doing so, and also his position being different from the black power term himself as being a cranky conservative. So they were both sides, in some sense, were calling the other conservative. And so which one's more left wing?
And one time.
So question for Coleman. Can you expand on, in your view, what role does the Democratic Party, as it was reconstituted coming out of the 70s, what role does the Democratic Party play in extending, black power to the identity politics that we see today? Like, meaning, in your view, how is it the case that the Democratic Party from the 70s until now has this apparent monopoly on, has achieved a monopoly on like deciding what's a viable Black politics. They, somehow think that they can speak on behalf of the Black community. Like, can you talk about that? And then just a question for Jim, piggybacking off of, I guess, Jack and Spencer. You're basically, I think you're suggesting that it's a thought crime that, Bayard Rustin was, didn't oppose the anti-war movement, right? And I guess from my point of view, I wonder, like, what did the anti-war movement, can you just briefly state what did the anti-war movement actually achieve for the left? What did it actually achieve for the struggle for global socialism? Because from my point of view, it seems like there was something of a left, in the 60s. There's nothing of a left today. So, like, I'm wondering why we're still penalizing Bayard Rustin for being opposed to the anti-war movement when it seems like the anti-war movement, like, at least from my point of view, like, what did it get me as somebody who's interested in the left today?
Okay, so your question first, Republicans stopped courting Black voters, stopped making any attempt to really win them over, the Southern strategy. And obviously in the 1930s, almost all Black people voted Republican, and by the 1960s and certainly 70s, that had switched for reasons that made sense from a self-interest perspective from Black voters. And in general, I don't think it's the fault of the Democratic Party necessarily, but it's the influence of ideas and the idea of Black power, the idea that your identity is, your politics is given or entailed by your identity has become much more popular just in the past 5 years, but also broadly in the past several decades. And the Democratic Party has responded to that. Sometimes it has given that too much weight because it sees all, the 2% of Americans on Twitter or whatever that determine the tenor of the conversation are disproportionately those who align with identity politics, whereas the voting population is much more moderate on that issue. And so part of it has been a strategic mistake, I think, and part of it has been just a consequence of the popularity of these particular ideas, that it is a revolution of ideas that has taken place. And you can see that on our campus, I think, obviously. With regards to your question, which was more conservative? Of course, it just depends what you're talking about. Malcolm X was originally part of the Nation of Islam. Elijah Muhammad, socially conservative in virtually every way, resembled much more a traditional evangelical Christian mindset towards male-female relationships and whatnot. And so in every way, it was socially conservative. Of course, Malcolm X broke with them. But there were other elements of the Black Power movement that didn't have any of that social conservative baggage. So it really depends which strain of the Black Power movement you're talking. There was a very conservative flavor and a not as conservative flavor.
On that, I would say there was one very important way in which the Malcolm X and the Black Power movement was less conservative than mainstream liberal integrationists and even Martin Luther King. And that was on the question of Black self-defense, which in a way was a kind of formed a dividing line between the Black radicals and Black liberals at the time. Martin Luther King, who did break with the Democrats, nevertheless, held all his life a position of nonviolent resistance in principle, not simply as a tactic. The Malcolm X and the Black Power movement rejected that. They didn't think, or most of them didn't think, that the Blacks were going to make a revolution in the United States. But they did think that when Blacks came under attack, which was very frequent at that time, they had a right to defend themselves. That was a position I would characterize as being to the left of the liberals. As far as Vietnam is concerned, I know you.
Republicans held that position.
What?
Wouldn't you say a lot of conservatives held that position?
The blacks had the right to defend themselves, yes.
No.
Republicans think that.
And the Republicans did not think that blacks should be able to defend themselves arms in hand. No. Now, on the I know you remember the 50s, that happens to be at my age, the first decade I remember. So you ask what difference the anti-war movement made. Well, in the 50s, this country was in the grip of Cold War anti-communism, and anybody with a leftist point of view risked being fired, ostracized. In 1965, when I first went to Penn State, because I was president of the Socialist Club, I had my room broken into, my belongings destroyed. I had bricks thrown at my head. I was surrounded by hostile mobs. This was before things turned. And I would submit that in a lot of the country, anyway, the Vietnam anti-war movement changed that. It broke the hold of Cold War anti-communism on the over the minds of large sections of the American people. And believe me, it's much easier to be a leftist today than before. Now, as far as world politics are concerned, I think, and I continue to think, that the Vietnamese people during that struggle wrote the most heroic chapter in the later half of the 20th century. Vietnam did not turn into a workers' paradise, and U.S. imperialism was not brought down, but the world looks very differently. In those days, before the defeat in Vietnam, the U.S. felt at liberty to intervene just about anywhere in the non-Soviet bloc, non-Sino-Soviet bloc, to topple governments, to bribe other governments to toe the U.S. line in Europe and in the Third World. The influence of the United States and its ability to intervene are very much curtailed as a result of what the ruling class calls the Vietnam syndrome. The victory of the Vietnamese created that syndrome. I think that was a positive result.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, so